Hey guys, I hope you are enjoying the start of the Book of Joy with His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Archbishop Desmond Tutu. We're going to start with the chapter Arrival, We Are Fragile Creatures. So this is the photo that we have for when they arrived in Dharamshala. We are fragile creatures, and it is from this weakness, not despite it, that we discover the possibility of true joy, the Archbishop said as I handed him his sleek black cane with the silver handle shaped like a greyhound. Life is filled with challenges and adversity, the Archbishop continued. Fear is inevitable, as is pain and eventually death. Take the return of the prostate cancer. Well, it does focus the mind. One of the side effects of the medicine the Archbishop was taking is fatigue, and he had slept for most of the flight to India, a beige blanket pulled up over his head. We had planned to talk on the flight, but sleep was most important, and now he was trying to share his thoughts quickly as we approached Dharamshala. We had stopped off in Amritsar for the night so he could rest, and because the airport in Dharamsala was open only for a couple of hours a day. This morning, we had visited the famed I'm going to try to pronounce these names as inoffensively as I can. Harmandir Sahib, the Sikh religion's holiest site. The upper stories are clad in gold, resulting in its popular name, the Golden Temple. There are 4 doors to get into the Gurdwara, which symbolizes the tradition's openness toward all people and all religions. This seemed like an appropriate place to pay our respects as we were embarking on an interfaith meeting that would bring 2 of the world's great religions, Christianity and Buddhism, into deep dialogue. As we were swallowed into a throng of the temple's 100,000 daily visitors, we got the call. The Dalai Lama had decided to meet the Archbishop at the airport, a rare honor that he bestows on very few of the endless stream of visiting dignitaries. We were told that he was already on his way. We raced to get out of the temple and back to the airport as we pushed the Archbishop in his wheelchair, his bald head covered by an orange handkerchief, a required sign of respect at the temple, which made him look like a day-glow pirate. The van tried to inch its way through the traffic-choked streets of Amritsar as a symphony of car horns played, the mass of cars, pedestrians, bicycles, scooters, and animals all jostling for position. Concrete buildings lined the roads, their rebar sticking out in an always unfinished state of expansion. We finally made it to the airport and onto the plane. We wished that the 20-minute flight would go even faster, concerned now that the Dalai Lama would be waiting on the tarmac. Discovering more joy does not, I'm sorry to say, the Archbishop added as we began our descent, save us from the inevitabilities of hardship and heartbreak. In fact, we may cry more easily, but we will laugh more easily too. Perhaps we are just more alive. Yet, as we discover more joy, we can face suffering in a way that ennobles rather than embitters. We have hardship without becoming hard. We have heartbreak without being broken. I had witnessed both the Archbishop's tears and his laughter so many times. Well, more his laughter than his tears, in truth, but he does cry easily and often for that which is not yet redeemed, for that which is not yet whole. It all matters to him. It all affects him deeply. His prayers, in which I have been enveloped, reach around the world to all who are in need and suffering. One of his book editors had a grandson who was ill and on the Archbishop's very long daily prayer list. Several years later, the editor asked if he would once again pray for his grandson because the child's illness had returned. The Archbishop replied that he had never stopped praying for the boy. From the plane, we could see the snow-covered mountains that are the postcard backdrop to the Dalai Lama's home in exile. After the Chinese invasion of Tibet, the Dalai Lama and 100,000 other Tibetans fled to India. These refugees were temporarily settled in the lowlands of India, where the heat and mosquitoes led a great many to become ill. Eventually, the government of India established the Dalai Lama's residence in Dharamsala, and the Dalai Lama was very grateful for the higher altitude and the cooler weather. Over time, many Tibetans came to settle here as well, as if the community was heartsick for the mountainous landscape and high altitude of their home. And of course, most of all, they wanted to be close to their spiritual and political leader. Dharamsala is in the North Indian state of Himachal Pradesh, and the British, when they ruled India, also used to come here to escape the relentless heat of the Indian summer. As we approached this former British hill station, we could see the green carpet of pine trees and the agricultural fields below. Dense storm clouds and fog often close the small airport as it did on my last visit. But today, the sky was blue, the wisps of clouds held at bay by the mountains. We descended for the steep landing. One great question underlies our existence, the Dalai Lama had said before the trip. What is the purpose of life? After much consideration, I believe that the purpose of life is to find happiness. It does not matter whether one is Buddhist like me, or a Christian like the Archbishop, or any other religion, or no religion at all. From the moment of birth, every human being wants to discover happiness and avoid suffering. No differences in our culture or our education or our religion affect this. From the very core of our being, we simply desire joy and contentment. But so often these feelings are fleeting and hard to find, like a butterfly that lands on us and then flutters away. The ultimate source of happiness is within us. Not money, not power, not status. Some of my friends are billionaires, but they are very unhappy people. Power and money failed to bring inner peace. Outward attainment will not bring real inner joyfulness. We must look inside. Sadly, many of the things that undermine our joy and happiness we create ourselves. Often it comes from the negative tendencies of the mind, emotional reactivity, or from our inability to appreciate and utilize the resources that exist within us. The suffering from a natural disaster we cannot control, but the suffering from our daily disasters we can. We create most of our suffering, so it should be logical that we also have the ability to create more joy. It simply depends on the attitudes, the perspectives, and the reactions we bring to situations and to our relationships with other people. When it comes to personal happiness, there is a lot that we as individuals can do. We lurched forward as the brakes seized the tires, and then the plane rumbled and shook, stopping quickly on the short runway. Out the window of the airplane, we could see the Dalai Lama standing on the tarmac, a large yellow umbrella held over his head to protect him from the bright Indian sun. He was wearing his maroon robe and red shawl, although we could see a small patch of saffron yellow on his sleeveless vest. An entourage of office staff and airport officials in suits flanked him. Indian soldiers in khaki uniforms were providing security. The media had been kept outside of the airport. This was going to be an intimate reunion with only the Dalai Lama's personal photographer taking pictures. As the Archbishop hobbled down the steep stairs in his blue blazer and signature fisherman's cap, the Dalai Lama approached. The Dalai Lama was smiling, his eyes sparkling behind his large square-framed glasses. He bowed low, and then the Archbishop spread his arms out, and they embraced. They separated and held each other's shoulders, gazing into each other's eyes, as if trying to convince themselves that they really were together again. "I haven't seen you in a long while," Archbishop Tutu said as he touched the Dalai Lama's cheek tenderly with the tips of his fingers and inspected him closely. "You look very good." The Dalai Lama, still holding the Archbishop's small shoulders, puckered as if to blow him a kiss. The Archbishop raised his left hand, gold wedding ring shining, and clasped the Dalai Lama's chin as one might do to one's precious grandchild. Then the Archbishop went in for a kiss on the cheek. The Dalai Lama, not used to kisses from anyone, flinched, but also laughed with delight, which was quickly accompanied by the Archbishop's high-pitched cackle. "You don't like a kiss," the Archbishop said, and gave him another on the other cheek. I wondered how many kisses the Dalai Lama had received in his whole life, taken from his parents at age 2 and raised in a rarefied realm far away from kisses. They stopped for the formal presentation of kata, a wife's scarf, a Tibetan custom of greeting and respect. The Dalai Lama bowed with hands pressed together at his heart, the gesture of welcome that recognizes our oneness. The Archbishop took off his fisherman's cap and bowed in return. The Dalai Lama then draped the long white silk scarf around the Archbishop's neck. They whispered into each other's ears, trying to talk over the noise of the jet still droning in the background. The Dalai Lama took the Archbishop's hand, and then they were more 8 than 80, laughing and making jokes together as they strolled toward the terminal, yellow umbrella sheltering above them. Even though the Archbishop's white scarf was bunched around his neck, it still hung all the way down his small body. The size of the kata one gives is a sign of the esteem that one holds for the recipient, high lamas receiving the longest ones. This kata was the longest one I have ever seen. The Archbishop joked throughout the week, as kata after kata was draped around his neck, that he felt like a human coat rack. We were ushered into a small room with a couple of brown couches set aside for the Dalai Lama to await his often delayed or canceled flights out of Dharamsala. We could see the media gathered outside the airport, lining the glass wall, waiting for a chance to snap a photograph or ask a question. It was only then that I recalled how newsworthy and even historic this trip was. It had been so easy to get lost in the logistics or to forget that their time together was an important event for the world. In the lounge, the Archbishop relaxed into a couch while the Dalai Lama was perched into a large chair beside him. Next to the Archbishop sat his daughter, Pho, who was dressed in a brilliant green and red African print dress, her head wrapped with a matching fabric. The youngest of 4 children, she followed her father into the ministry and was now the executive director of the Desmond and Leah Tutu Legacy Foundation. During our trip, Pho would get down on bended knee and propose to her girlfriend, Marceline Van Firth. The trip was only a couple months before the U.S. Supreme Court made its landmark ruling legalizing gay marriage, but the Archbishop had supported gay rights for decades. He famously had said that he would refuse to go to a homophobic heaven. What many forget, especially those who find themselves on the receiving end of his moral censure, is that the Archbishop decries any form of oppression or discrimination, wherever he might find it. Shortly after the marriage, Fo was stripped of her ministry because the South African Anglican Church does not recognize gay marriage. I was really looking forward to coming to your birthday, the Dalai Lama said, but your government had some difficulties. At that time you expressed some very strong words, the Dalai Lama said as he put his hand on the Archbishop's forearm, and I appreciated it. Strong words was an understatement. The week in Dharamsala to celebrate the Dalai Lama's birthday had its origins 4 years earlier when Archbishop Tutu celebrated his own 80th birthday in Cape Town, South Africa. The Dalai Lama had been invited to be the guest of honor, but the South African government bowed to pressure from the Chinese government and was unwilling to issue the Dalai Lama a visa. China is one of the major buyers of South African minerals and raw materials. The Archbishop was daily on the front page of the South African newspapers leading up to the celebration, railing against the government for their perfidy and duplicity. He even compared the ruling African National Congress, the party whose members he fought for decades to help bring out of exile and imprisonment, to the long-hated apartheid government. He said that they were actually worse because, at least in the case of the apartheid government, the villainy was overt. I always tried to avoid any inconvenience, the Dalai Lama said with a grin, and then pointed to the Archbishop. But I was happy someone else was willing to be an inconvenience. I was very happy. I know, the Archbishop said. You use me, that's the trouble. You use me and I don't learn. The Archbishop then put out his hand and took the Dalai Lama's tenderly. When the South Africans refused to let you come for my 80th birthday, it made the whole event all the more spectacular because we had Google hosting our conversation and there was a lot more press interest than there might have otherwise been. But never mind, wherever you are, there's a lot of interest. I'm not jealous. You know, I remember when we were in Seattle, they were looking for a venue that would be large enough for the people who wanted to come see you, and it ended up that they found a football stadium. There were 70,000 people who wanted to come hear this man, and he can't even speak English properly. The Dalai Lama let out a big belly laugh. It's really not nice, the Archbishop continued. You really need to pray that I become a little more popular like you. To tease someone is a sign of intimacy and friendship, to know that there is a reservoir of affection from which we all drink as funny and flawed humans. And yet their jokes were as much about themselves as about each other, never really putting the other down, but constantly reinforcing their bond and their friendship. The Archbishop wanted to thank and introduce each of the people who had helped make the trip possible. He introduced his daughter Fo, philanthropist and peace builder Pam Omidyar, and me, but the Dalai Lama said he already knew all of us. Then he introduced my wife Rachel as his American doctor, Pat Christian, a colleague of Pam's from the Omidyar group, and his daughter's soon-to-be fiancée, Marceline, a pediatrician and professor of epidemiology in Holland. He did not need to introduce the final member of our party, the Venerable Lama Tenzin Doden, who was a member of the Dalai Lama's own Namgyal monastery. Now, the Dalai Lama was rubbing the Archbishop's hand warmly as he would throughout the week. They were talking about the flight itinerary and our stopover in Amritsar. This is very good, necessary to rest, the Dalai Lama said. I always sleep 8 to 9 hours a night. But you get up very early, don't you? The Archbishop asked. That's right, 3 o'clock. 3 o'clock? Always. And you pray 5 hours? The Archbishop was holding up 5 fingers for emphasis. Yes. The Archbishop looked upward and shook his head. No, that's too much. Sometimes I do meditation on the nature of self using what is known as the sevenfold analysis, the Dalai Lama said. Jinpa later explained that this is a Buddhist contemplative practice in which one searches for the true nature of the self by analyzing the relationship between oneself and the physical and mental aspects of our body and mind. For example, the Dalai Lama continued, now when I look at you and I analyze, I see that this is my dear respected friend Bishop Tutu. No, this is his body, not himself. This is his mind, not himself. The Dalai Lama leaned in to emphasize his point, presenting a paradoxical riddle as old as Buddhism. Where is Bishop Tutu's self? We can't find it. He slapped the Archbishop's forearm playfully. The Archbishop looked a little mystified and a little bemused. Really? So now, the Dalai Lama concluded, in quantum physics, they also have a similar view. Any objective thing does not really exist. There is nothing ultimately we can find. This is similar to analytical meditation. The Archbishop put his hands over his face in bewilderment. I couldn't do that. The Dalai Lama may have been arguing against there being an essential Bishop Tutu, but at the same time, there was a person, a friend that was special to him in a way that, despite his friendliness to all, was unique and clearly important to him. Jinpa and I discussed what it was about this relationship that probably meant so much. For both of them, it was rare to have a true friend. There are, after all, not many members of the Moral Leaders Club. Their lives are filled with people who relate to them as icons. It must be a relief to find someone who is not looking for a photo op. Certainly, they also share values at a place where the core of all religions meet, and of course, they share a fantastic sense of humor. I was beginning to see how central friendship and relationship more generally was in our experience of joy. This was a theme that would arise many times in our week together. I tell people, said the Archbishop, that one of the greatest things about you is your serenity. And I say, well, every day he spends those 5 hours in the morning meditating. And it shows in how you respond to things that are agonizing, the pain of your country and the pain of the world. And I say, I try, but 5 hours is too much. The Archbishop, characteristically humble and self-effacing, was dismissing his own 3 or 4 hours of prayer a day. It is true, he sleeps in until 4. What is it, I wondered, about spiritual leaders that they're always getting up early to pray and meditate? It clearly makes a great difference in how they approach their day. When I first heard that the Dalai Lama got up at 3 a.m., I thought I was going to hear another story of superhuman devotion and learn that he only slept 2 or 3 hours a night. I was relieved to hear that he simply went to bed very early, typically by 7 p.m. Not exactly practical for a householder who has children to feed and get to bed, I thought, but perhaps getting to bed an hour earlier and up an hour earlier was possible. Would it lead to more spiritual growth? Would it lead to more joy? The Dalai Lama held the Archbishop's hand up to his cheek. So now we go to my home. As we walked out of the airport, the media crowded around the two leaders and shouted questions about the Archbishop's trip. The Archbishop stopped to answer and to use the attention of the media to shine a spotlight on injustice. He spoke as the clicks of the cameras peppered his comments. I'm so glad to be with my dear friend. Often things and people try to keep us apart, but the love that we have for each other and the goodness of God's universe ensures that we shall meet. The first time that the South African government refused him a visa when he was going to come to my 80th birthday, I asked him, how many divisions do you have in your army? Why is China scared of you? And that is what surprises me. Maybe they're right. A spiritual leader is something that should be taken very seriously. We hope that God's world will become a better place, more hospitable to goodness, more hospitable to compassion, more hospitable to generosity, more hospitable to living together so that we don't have what is happening now between Russia and the Ukraine, or what is happening with ISIS, or what is happening in Kenya or Syria. They make God weep. The Archbishop turned to leave, but then paused again as another journalist asked about the purpose of his trip. We are together just to enjoy our friendship and to talk about joy. The Archbishop and the Dalai Lama were whisked away by a waiting motorcade. The drive to the Dalai Lama's residence was about 3/4 of an hour. The streets had been closed to allow the Dalai Lama to go to the airport, and Tibetans, Indians, and a few tourists were lining the streets, hoping to get a glimpse of him and his special guest. I realize now why the Dalai Lama so rarely makes the pilgrimage to the airport. It is a major logistical operation that shuts down one of the main roads and impacts the whole city. We were here to discuss joy in the face of life's challenges, and everywhere in Dharamsala were reminders that this was a community that had been traumatized by oppression and exile. The town clings to winding hillside roads, and craft stalls hang over the edges of sheer cliffs. Like construction throughout India and so much of the developing world, building codes and security precautions were waved aside to make room for the exploding population. I wondered how these structures would fare in an earthquake and feared that the whole city might be shaken off the backs of these mountains like a leaf from a waking animal. The motorcade snaked up as the lines of the devout thickened, some burning incense and many others with mala beads draped around their prayerfully cupped hands. It is hard for non-Tibetans to understand how much the Dalai Lama means to the Tibetan people, and this exile community in particular. He is both the symbol of their national and political identity and also the embodiment of their spiritual aspirations. To be the embodiment of the I'm not going to be able to pronounce that, of compassion means in many ways to be a Christ-like figure. I can only imagine how challenging it must be for the Dalai Lama to carry this responsibility while also trying to emphasize his being nothing special, just one of the 7 billion people. The streets narrowed, and I wondered how our speeding cars could possibly pass through the throng of people, but we seemed to slow only for the occasional sacred cow that meandered into the street, perhaps also to get a better glimpse of the 2 holy men. I wondered if the careening pace was due to security concerns or a desire to reopen the roads, but I guess more likely the former. This city, like all of India's cities, is formed through the constant friction of tectonic layers of culture, shifting and jostling with each other in a vibrant and sometimes uneasy display of devotion and identity. The Tibetan Buddhist hilltop town of McLeod Ganj, known also as Upper Dharamsala, is one of more sedimentary level on top of the Indian Hindu city. Dharamsala, or Dharamshala, as it is pronounced in Hindi, means spiritual dwelling, combining the word dharma, or spiritual teaching, with shala, which is a dwelling, and the whole name means pilgrim's lodge or rest house. It is a fitting name for a city that is the site of so much pilgrimage today. We hurried through the simple metal gates of the Dalai Lama's complex, where his offices and private residence are located. We arrived at a semicircular driveway surrounding a bed bursting with spring flowers. I had visited Dharamsala in January to meet with the Dalai Lama's office to plan this trip. At the time, the whole town was shrouded in clouds and freezing cold, but now the sun was shining brightly, the flowers all the more eager to bloom as they always seemed to be in the brief growing season at higher altitudes, their lives cut short, every day seemingly more urgent and appreciated. As the beginning of the dialogues grew closer, I realized I was becoming increasingly nervous, but I also knew that I was not the only one. As on one of our planning calls for the trip, I had been touched by the Archbishop's honest expression of concern about crossing wits with the Dalai Lama. He is much more cerebral, he had said, referring to the Dalai Lama's great love of debate, intellectual inquiry, and scientific exploration. I am more instinctual, he had said, and I remembered him saying that deep visceral knowledge and prayerful surrender had guided all of the major turning points in his life and his mission in the struggle to end apartheid. I guess even great spiritual leaders get nervous when they're journeying into the unknown. After a day of rest for the Archbishop, we would begin the dialogues on the nature of true joy. So that is what we will address tomorrow, the nature of true joy. Hope you enjoyed this, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.